In this week's Property Insider video, Dr. Andrew Wilson explains why it's illogical that interest rates are going to rise despite rising petrol prices, despite rising building costs and the various on-flow effects to inflation. If you want to understand what's happening to our property markets and what's ahead for our economy, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so each week you'll be updated with our thoughts. While you're there, why not click on the little bell icon so you can be updated when a show comes out. After living through a couple of years many of us would rather forget, a lot of Australians were looking forward to 2022, looking forward to a year when our lives got back to normal. But we're just a couple of months into the year and millions of Australians have been affected by devastating floods, and all of us are going to be affected in one way or another by the horrific war between Russia and Ukraine. And while the floods can't douse our appetite for property, there are going to be flow-on effects to inflation and interest rates. And I'm looking forward to exploring this and the rest of the week's property news in this week's Property Insider chat with Dr. Andrew Wilson, Australia's leading housing economist and chief economist of My Housing Markets. Hi, Andrew.
Yes, hello, Michael, and another interesting week, of course, going forward, and it's going to get even more interesting because we have the big E word going to start dominating conversations, and of course, E stands for election. And
an election and a budget coming up too, Andrew.
So we've perhaps seen some early signs in terms of the economic outlook being gilded a little bit by the Treasurer, but there's not a surprise there, is it? It's obviously with such a strong conversation around the prospect of higher interest rates, regardless of the likelihood of that, it's still something the Treasurer has to address, and it's not a positive, I think, in terms of sentiment for the electorate to be going into an election with the prospect, even if it's just a conversation of higher interest rates.
Well, last week the Reserve Bank Governor made some statements which many of the commentators now believe he's changed his views. When he spoke about the recent economic developments, Lowe said Australia's envious performance, our economic performance in the first months of 2021, has now collided with natural disasters and the unpredictable impact of Ukraine's war with Russia. So he has suggested that now there's a plausible argument for interest rates going up later this year.
Well, he's been using that word plausible for over a month now, Michael, and I think it's really a neither hot nor cold word, really, in terms of the outlook. It just means if the data reflects higher interest rates in terms particularly of higher wages, then obviously it's plausible that interest rates would rise, but it will all rely on the data, and that's the plausibility of all this is about how the data moves. But I think it just seems the Reserve Bank government finds himself under a little bit of pressure. He did nominate particular dates in terms of his outlook. He stopped doing that now. The outlook now is generalised rather than, as he was suggesting, 2024 for the next rise in rates. Even though that may still prove to be correct, I think that he doesn't want to be seen to be wrong, particularly given how strong the market sentiment is, and a lot of forecasts are still predicting higher interest rates as early as June. Let's hope, Michael, we can hold them all accountable for these predictions if, which I believe is more plausible, that they don't occur. But we'll see what happens. I noticed the market, whatever the market is, has just shifted back a little bit on its predictions of when interest rates will rise now by a month or so. They're sending those predictions a little bit backwards. But none of the data has changed, Michael. This is the issue. The data has remained the same. The data that is critical in terms of interest rate increases, the inflation data, which will likely get worse, unfortunately, before it gets better. It is the wages data, and that is the clear driver of higher interest rates will be a consistent period of strong wages growth. And I think we're a long, long way away from that, Michael, but we'll see.
Well, the risk of inflation has definitely moved to the upside, Andrew. We're all noticing higher petrol prices at the bowser, but that also means that transport costs go up, and so therefore it'll trickle through to food and other items. But what about the floods? They're going to create some shortages of goods as well, aren't they?
Yes, it never rains, it pours, if I could use that, Michael.
Oh, I shouldn't have even giggled about that. That is a shame.
No, that's true. Well, I'm not either, but it's true. And we know that we have issues to do with supply constraints that are beyond our control, particularly in terms of the price of oil. And now we've got local factors with the floods, which will constrain not just the production of fruit and vegetables, but also the delivery and supply of fruit and vegetable. That, of course, will have a significant impact on headline inflation data. And we must remember that the underlying nature of inflation will, because these are one-off effects, that will take into account the fact that these are one-off effects. But nonetheless, it's no comfort to those who are running family budgets now to have to account for significantly higher fuel costs, now well over $2 a litre in Sydney. And now they're going to have to face higher fruit and vegetable costs as well. And as you so rightly suggested, Michael, higher fuel costs has a particular downstream energy to it in terms of pushing up generalised prices of goods and services because of the reliance on transport. Employers have to pass on these costs, so that means higher prices. But as I said before, we don't have higher wages yet to substantiate any sense of higher interest rates.
Another factor on inflation is building costs. And I know My Housing Market has a house building cost index, and you've recently been looking at what that means. What's going on in the cost of constructing a dwelling, Andrew?
Yes, My Housing Market runs a monthly index of building costs, and these are based on a quarterly model. So it runs the quarter's data every month just to take out some of that monthly volatility. The latest data, Michael, shows that although building costs are continuing to increase strongly, the quarterly trend has declined. But despite that reduction in the quarterly trend, the actual annual increase in building costs, and these are building costs for new houses, which is the measure that the ABS uses in its inflation rate methodology, that those annual costs in quarterly changes are now the highest on record. So there's no relief in terms of higher building costs playing their way into the inflation rate, Michael, which will push up higher over the next couple of quarters until we do start to see a significant easing in that underlying trend. And, it's across the board, really. It was interesting that Perth recorded the strongest growth over the quarter in building costs. And Perth, of course, has had a significant building boom as a result of home builder. And home builder is what has driven these extraordinary increases in building costs. We know home builder was a stimulus package introduced by the federal government last year, very successful, but of course it's created demand, which has meant constraints on supply, which of course has created shortages of building materials and labour, and that's why we have higher prices. But even though we're back to more of a normalised environment for building approvals, which by the way have been a little lower lately, it will take some time for those supply constraints to work their way into the system with lower building costs. So that means we will get higher headline inflation and underlying inflation over the next couple of quarters, and with no real prospect of that being a moderating effect. So we are going to continue to see higher inflation rates, headline rates particularly, added to higher fuel costs. Fuel costs are also continuing to rise, Michael, as you suggested, as a result of the Ukraine-Russian war. Of course, then we have fruit and vegetables added onto that. So we are in for a lengthy period of higher inflation. I'm not sure we'll reach those heady heights that the US are currently experiencing. But, and of course, the big picture here is the stimulus package generally that we had during COVID. Most advanced economies had significant stimulus packages which brought forward demand, created jobs, which was the plan, but it also created the prospect of higher prices because in the shorter term, we couldn't match that higher levels of demand with supply. We are going to see higher inflation. The question is, how are households going to pay for it, Michael, if we don't have higher wages? I still believe we have a retarded environment for wage changes in relation to inflation changes. And I think that there's going to be some tough environment for those household budgets with prices rising well ahead of the rate of wage increases. And I think we might be in for maybe a record period of real wage declines going forward.
The last couple of years stifling a lot of businesses with Omicron, with Delta, with COVID in general, and now the floods affecting a lot of businesses. I can see that there's going to be a difficult capacity for small businesses and large businesses to increase wages.
Yeah, that's right, Michael. And the bottom line to all of this discussion, when we are focusing on interest rates, is this is the absolute last circumstances, the last economic environment that the Reserve Bank would be considering increasing costs of households and businesses by raising interest rates and reducing demand by higher interest rates, which is the theory from the textbooks, is that's why we do it. High inflation, we need to raise interest rates. And if they do that, it'll only create more economic stress, which is very hard to alleviate in the shorter term, even if they moved into reverse gear and then cut interest rates. So as I said, it's illogical in these circumstances, without strong wages growth, to be raising interest rates, particularly when the December quarter data showed us that real wages are falling now.
Well, Andrew, over the weekend, the long weekend, a number of states enjoyed, and the floods that unfortunately affected other states didn't seem to impede our auction markets.
No, it was obviously one of those weekends, Michael, where the results you have to take with a grain of salt. And we did that. Melbourne, Adelaide had Labor Day long weekends. As a result of that, we saw a significant drop in the number of auctions conducted. This always occurs. And interestingly, in Melbourne, there's a big proportion, and Adelaide, of higher priced properties that certainly are missing from the market over those holiday periods. But nonetheless, Melbourne, I think, still recorded quite a positive result. Labor Day auction numbers, if we compare Labor Day this year with last year, which was a week earlier, numbers were around about the same, a little bit higher in Melbourne. But I think the clearance rate was still quite reasonable for quite solid holiday numbers. In Adelaide, again, which had Labor Day, their numbers were also down marginally. And again, a strong clearance rate for the Adelaide market, which continues to track the highest of all the markets. And Canberra had Canberra Day, Michael, as its long weekend, Canberra Day. And we obviously saw a big reduction in the number of auctions in Canberra. The other two capitals, Brisbane and Sydney, had normal numbers of auctions scheduled, Michael, but the clearance rates were down because if we look a little more closely at the data, there were a high number of withdrawals. So a lot of those scheduled auctions were withdrawn, obviously because of the impact of the floods in both Brisbane and Sydney. So again, we need to take these results with a grain of salt. It was Sydney's lowest auction result of the year so far. We need to wait until the flood issues dissipate in terms of a full auction weekend coming forward for both Sydney and Brisbane.
Well, as we said a bit earlier on, there's an election coming up, there's a budget coming up, so there's going to be lots of property news for us to discuss each week. Look forward to catching up with you again next week, Andrew.
Yes, we live in interesting times, Michael.